In a shocking primetime clash that America can't stop talking about, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett maintains ice-cold composure after former Attorney General Pam Bondi crosses the line with a personal attack. What happens next leaves the entire studio audience speechless and ignites a firestorm across the nation. The lights of the Washington Week roundtable discussion burned bright that evening, illuminating five faces locked in what had begun as a policy debate but was rapidly spiraling into something far more personal. The network had promoted this special edition as a meeting of the minds to discuss recent controversial legislation, but producers were getting exactly what they'd secretly hoped for: conflict, tension, and the kind of raw emotion that drives viewership numbers through the roof. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone, her expression calm despite the palpable tension. Across from her, former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi leaned forward, her voice rising with each word. The moderator, sensing ratings gold, had long abandoned attempts to steer the conversation back to policy matters. "The problem with your perspective, Congresswoman," Bondi said, emphasizing the title with a subtle hint of mockery, "is that you're operating from a position of theoretical idealism rather than practical reality. These programs cost taxpayers billions, and the American people deserve better than empty promises packaged as progress." Crockett raised an eyebrow, waiting for Bondi to finish. The studio audience, comprised of politically engaged citizens from across the spectrum, shifted in their seats. They had come expecting a substantive debate, but were now witnesses to something brewing beneath the surface, something more personal than political. "If I may respond," Crockett began, her voice steady, "the data actually contradicts what you're suggesting. When we look at similar programs implemented at the state level, we see a net positive return on investment within just 3 fiscal quarters. This isn't idealism, it's mathematics." The moderator nodded, attempting to regain control. "Let's move on to the next topic." "No, I'd like to finish," Bondi interrupted, color rising in her cheeks. "What we're seeing here is typical of the current administration's approach. All talk, no results." The tension in the studio thickened. A camera operator zoomed in on Crockett's face, capturing the momentary flash in her eyes before her expression returned to one of professional composure. "Results are precisely what I'm discussing," Crockett replied. "But if you're not interested in the actual numbers, just say that." Something shifted in Bondi's demeanor then, a subtle hardening around the eyes that the cameras caught in high definition. Later, media analysts would replay this moment dozens of times, identifying it as the exact second when the debate transformed into something more dangerous. "What I'm interested in, Congresswoman," Bondi said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that somehow felt more threatening than a shout, "is authenticity. And frankly, this performative righteousness act is wearing thin. The constant victim narrative isn't just tiresome, it's damaging to the very communities you claim to champion." A collective intake of breath swept through the studio. The moderator half rose from her seat, but it was too late. "Let's be honest," Bondi continued, leaning closer to her microphone. "You got where you are because the party needed a certain demographic checkbox filled, not because of merit or qualification. And every time someone challenges you on substance, you hide behind identity politics. It's a disservice to your constituents and, quite frankly, embarrassing to watch." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the production crew, usually immune to on-air dramatics, froze in place. The moderator's mouth opened and closed without sound. In the control room, producers were simultaneously horrified and ecstatic. This was television gold, however inappropriate. For 3 full seconds, Congresswoman Crockett didn't move. The camera lingered on her face as she appeared to process not just the words but their implication. The audience waited, some uncomfortable, others morbidly fascinated, all completely captivated. When Crockett finally spoke, her voice was quiet but crystal clear. "Ms. Bondi," she began, deliberately dropping the formal title, "I want to thank you." Confusion flickered across Bondi's face. "I want to thank you," Crockett continued, "because you've just provided the entire country with a perfect demonstration of exactly what women of color face every single day in spaces like this. The assumption that achievement must be the result of tokenism rather than talent. The dismissal of factual arguments in favor of personal attacks. The expectation that I should either conform to your comfort level or be labeled as playing the victim." Crockett's gaze never wavered as she spoke, her voice gaining strength but never escalating to match Bondi's previous intensity. "You speak of authenticity," she continued, "while simultaneously suggesting I should be someone other than who I am. You claim to want substance, then ignore substantive points in favor of personal insults." The audience began to stir, the tension in the room shifting into something else entirely. A woman in the front row nodded vigorously. Behind her, others leaned forward, hanging on every word. "So thank you for making explicit what is usually kept implicit. Because every woman watching this, particularly every woman of color, just recognized something they've experienced but have often been told they imagined." Bondi's expression hardened further, her lips pressing into a thin line as she prepared to respond. But Crockett wasn't finished, and what she said next would transform this exchange from a momentary television spat into a cultural inflection point discussed in homes, offices, and social media platforms across America. "And now," Crockett said, her voice dropping to a tone that commanded absolute attention, "let me tell you exactly what's going to happen next. First, you're going to attempt to interrupt me, to regain control of this narrative," Crockett continued, raising a single finger. "When that fails, you'll try to paint me as angry or emotional, despite the fact that I'm speaking more calmly. Then you have this entire segment." True to prediction, Bondi immediately tried to interject. "That's not what—" "I wasn't finished," Crockett said, her tone unchanged, but somehow more powerful for its restraint. The moderator, recognizing a moment that transcended the usual political theater, made no attempt to intervene. "Second, after this broadcast ends, you'll tell colleagues I was difficult or impossible to reason with, despite the fact that I've cited specific policy outcomes while you've offered nothing but personal attacks." The audience was completely silent now, many leaning forward in their seats. A production assistant later described it as watching someone perform surgery with words. In the control room, the director signaled for camera 3 to push in tighter on Crockett's face. "And third, you'll never acknowledge what just happened here. That when confronted with facts that contradicted your position, you chose to question my legitimacy rather than address my argument." Bondi's face had transformed from confidence to something more complex, a mixture of defensiveness and the dawning realization that she had miscalculated badly. The cameras caught it all. The tightening around her eyes, the slight flush creeping up her neck, the subtle shifting in her seat as though physically uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. "What's happening right now," Crockett said, gesturing between them, "isn't about liberal versus conservative. It's not even about our policy disagreement. It's about a fundamental inability to see someone who looks like me as an equal participant in this conversation." A murmur rippled through the audience. On social media, clips were already being shared, commented on, and reshared at a rate that would later break the network's previous engagement records. "So let me be abundantly clear," Crockett continued, straightening the papers in front of her with deliberate precision. "I won't be shouted down, I won't be dismissed, and I certainly won't apologize for taking up space in rooms where people who look like me have historically been excluded." The studio lights seemed to intensify, or perhaps it was just the heightened awareness of everyone present that they were witnessing something significant. A young woman in the back row wiped at her eyes discreetly. You suggested I play the victim, Crockett said. But victimhood requires powerlessness. And make no mistake, she looked directly into the camera, speaking now not just to Bondi, but to everyone watching. I am not without power. Bondi finally found her voice. Congresswoman, you're deliberately misconstruing my words to create drama. This is exactly the problem with discourse today. Everything becomes about identity rather than ideas. On the contrary, Crockett replied, without missing a beat. You made it about identity the moment you suggested my achievements were based on demographic checkboxes rather than merit. I'm simply refusing to let that go unchallenged. The moderator, sensing an opportunity to regain control of the segment, attempted to pivot. Perhaps we should return to discussing the legislation. No, Bondi said sharply. I want to address this characterization of my comments, which is completely unfair. I never said— We have the tape, Crockett interjected calmly. We can roll it back right now if you'd like. The audience shifted again, some exchanging glances. This was uncharted territory for a political talk show. The veneer of civility had not just cracked, but shattered entirely. Bondi's expression hardened. This is a typical deflection tactic. When you can't win on substance, make it personal. The irony of this statement caused a few audible reactions from the audience. Someone near the front actually laughed out loud. Ms. Bondi, Crockett said, and somehow the use of the less formal address carried more weight than any raised voice could have. You questioned my qualifications and suggested I was selected based on race and gender rather than merit. If anyone made this personal, it was you. Bondi's jaw tightened visibly. The camera caught her hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles whitening. And furthermore, Crockett continued, your implication that discussions of race or gender are somehow a distraction from real issues reveals a fundamental blindness to the reality that many Americans face. For millions of citizens, those aren't abstract concepts. They're lived experiences that directly impact their access to opportunity, justice, and representation. A section of the audience began to applaud, forcing the moderator to raise her hands for quiet. The network executives, watching the monitors backstage, were torn between concern about the breakdown of format and excitement over the ratings this moment would generate. Bondi leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. You think you're untouchable because of who you are. That's your real privilege. The comment hung in the air for a moment before Crockett responded with something unexpected. A smile, not mocking or triumphant, but almost sympathetic. That's where you're wrong, she said quietly. I've never had the luxury of feeling untouchable. Every position I've held, every achievement on my resume has been questioned, second-guessed, or attributed to something other than my capabilities. The difference isn't that I think I'm untouchable. It's that I've learned to keep moving forward despite that constant scrutiny. The tension in the studio was electric now, building toward something that felt increasingly like a reckoning rather than a debate. In homes across America, viewers found themselves holding their breath, unable to look away from the unfolding drama. The moderator glanced nervously at her producers off-camera, receiving a subtle nod to let the moment play out. Ratings were skyrocketing as viewers across the country shared clips in real time. This wasn't just good television. It was cultural lightning in a bottle. Perhaps, Bondi said, attempting to regain her footing, we should focus on what unites us rather than what divides us. It was a classic pivot, the kind of statement typically employed to diffuse tension and claim moral high ground. Crockett nodded slowly, considering the statement. Unity is indeed valuable, she agreed, surprising some viewers with the apparent concession. But unity without accountability is just compliance. And I didn't come to Congress to comply with systems that need changing. A section of the audience broke into spontaneous applause. This time, the moderator didn't attempt to silence them. You see? Bondi gestured toward the crowd. This is entertainment, not governance. Sound bites over solutions. "No, Ms. Bondi," Crockett replied. "This is accountability. And it's uncomfortable because it rarely happens on national television." She turned slightly to address the full audience. "When someone in a position of authority suggests that a black woman's achievements must be the result of tokenism rather than talent, it's not just a personal insult. It's a perpetuation of a narrative that has been used to undermine and discredit generations of qualified individuals." The studio was completely silent now, the atmosphere dense with attention. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. "So let me be clear about something," Crockett continued. "I graduated cum laude. I passed the bar exam on my first attempt. I've won cases that changed lives. I was elected by constituents who believed in my capacity to represent their interests effectively. None of that happened because someone needed to check a demographic box." Bondi opened her mouth to respond, but Crockett raised her hand slightly, a gesture so confident that it commanded continued silence. "The truly disappointing reality is that no matter how qualified I am, no matter how prepared, no matter how reasoned my arguments, there will always be someone ready to suggest my presence is somehow illegitimate." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle across the studio. "That says nothing about my capabilities and everything about the persistence of certain biases in our society." One of the other panelists, a senior political analyst who had remained strategically quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up. "I think what we're witnessing here is precisely why representation matters. Different lived experiences bring different insights to policy discussions." Bondi shook her head, visibly frustrated. "This is exactly what's wrong with modern discourse. Any criticism is immediately framed as bias or prejudice, shutting down legitimate debate." "Criticism of my policies or proposals is always welcome," Crockett responded immediately. "Questioning whether I belong at this table in the first place is not criticism. It's an attempt to delegitimize my voice, and there's a crucial difference between the two." The moderator, sensing the exchange had reached a natural inflection point, attempted to reclaim control of the segment. "We have about 2 minutes left. Congresswoman Crockett, would you like to offer any final thoughts before we wrap up?" Crockett nodded, straightening in her chair. The camera pulled back slightly, capturing her full presence, poised, controlled, and unmistakably commanding the moment. "I'd like to speak directly to everyone watching who has ever been told they don't belong in a room, that their achievements must be the result of special treatment rather than hard work and talent." Her voice took on a quality that would later be described by media analysts as presidential. When someone questions your legitimacy, they're telling you more about their limitations than yours. She paused, looking directly into the camera. "To the young women watching, especially young women of color, you will face moments like this. People will attempt to make you doubt yourself, to silence you, to make you believe you must either conform to their expectations or be labeled difficult. When that happens, remember this moment." The studio was absolutely still. You don't need to raise your voice to be powerful. You don't need to match aggression with aggression. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to accept the narrative others try to impose on you, and continuing to take up space with dignity and clarity. The power of her words was reflected in the faces of audience members, many of whom were visibly moved. Even some of the production staff had stopped their usual bustling to listen. "Ms. Bondi," Crockett said, turning back to her debate opponent, who sat rigid in her chair, "I harbor no ill will toward you personally, but I will not allow anyone, regardless of their credentials or position, to suggest that my seat at this table was earned by anything other than merit and the trust of my constituents. That's not playing victim, that's standing in my truth." The moderator, recognizing the perfect closing moment, nodded to the producers. "And on that note, we'll have to end tonight's discussion. I want to thank all our panelists for what has certainly been a memorable conversation." As the cameras began to pull back for the wide shot that would lead into the commercial break, viewers at home could see something remarkable. Multiple audience members were on their feet, applauding, not with the polite, measured response typical of studio audiences, but with genuine enthusiasm. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. The aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. By midnight, clips of the exchange had been viewed over 4 million times across various platforms. "Stand in Your Truth" was trending nationally. Political commentators from across the spectrum were dissecting the moment, some framing it as a breakdown of civil discourse, others as a necessary confrontation with persistent undertones of racism and sexism in political spaces. 3 days later, when Crockett returned to her district office, she found hundreds of letters, many from young women sharing similar experiences of having their qualifications questioned or dismissed. A group of law students had organized a watch party for the segment, using it as a launching point for discussions about effective communication in hostile environments. When asked by reporters if she had further comments on the exchange, Crockett simply shook her head. "I said what needed to be said," she replied with a small smile. Sometimes one moment of truth does more than years of silent endurance. For Bondi, she declined multiple requests for interviews in the days following the broadcast. When she finally did make a public statement, it was brief and carefully worded. "While I stand by my policy positions, I regret that the discussion became personal rather than focusing on the issues that matter to Americans." The network, recognizing the cultural impact of the moment, announced a special series examining representation in politics. The first episode would feature women from both parties discussing their experiences navigating predominantly male spaces. But perhaps the most telling aftermath came 6 months later, when a freshman congresswoman faced similar questioning of her qualifications during a committee hearing. Without raising her voice, she responded, "As Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated, I don't need to justify my presence here. My work speaks for itself." The reference was immediately understood by everyone in the room, a testament to how thoroughly that single exchange had permeated the political consciousness. What had begun as a typical political debate had become something far more significant. A moment of clarity that forced viewers to confront uncomfortable truths about who gets questioned and who gets taken at their word, and a masterclass in responding to such challenges with dignity, intelligence, and unwavering confidence.